There is a number sitting quietly inside Valve's servers right now that the entire tech industry is pretending not to notice. It is not a scandal. It is not a leak. It is a single statistic buried inside a monthly hardware survey that almost nobody outside of forums and comment sections bothers to read. And yet that number just did something that has never happened before in the entire history of personal computing. For the first time ever, Linux crossed 5% of Steam's PC gaming population, while Windows, the operating system that has ruled every desktop on Earth for over 3 decades, quietly slipped below 93%. That sentence should not matter to you. On the surface, it sounds like a rounding error, a blip, the kind of statistic tech journalists mention once and forget. But here is where it gets worse. This is not a blip. This is a fracture. And once you understand what caused it, you will realize Microsoft did not lose this fight by accident. They lost it by choice. Let's start with what most people are not seeing. For years, the story of Windows versus Linux was framed as a hobbyist fantasy, a fringe obsession kept alive by programmers and command line purists who like to brag about using Arch, by the way. Windows was the empire. Linux was the resistance hiding in the mountains. Technically interesting, but never a real threat to the throne. That narrative held for almost 2 decades. And then, quietly, without a single press conference, without a single Microsoft executive sounding the alarm in public, the empire started leaking market share from every direction at once. Read that again. Not from one front, from every front simultaneously. Gaming, government, cloud infrastructure, developer workstations, even ordinary home users who had never typed a terminal command in their life. Something changed. And the deeper you dig into why, the more it starts to look less like an accident and more like the direct, inevitable result of decisions Microsoft made about its own product. Decisions that, according to informed industry observers, Microsoft is only now beginning to grasp the true cost of. Here is where the story actually begins. And it does not begin with Linux getting better. It begins with Windows getting worse. In October of 2025, Microsoft pulled the plug on Windows 10, ending official support for an operating system that, at the time, was still running on hundreds of millions of machines worldwide. That alone is not unusual. Every operating system eventually gets retired. But what Microsoft did next is the part nobody prepared users for. They told everyone the answer was simple: upgrade to Windows 11. Except for an enormous portion of the existing Windows install base, that upgrade was not simple. It was not even possible. Windows 11 demanded a security chip called TPM 2.0, a requirement that instantly disqualified tens of millions of otherwise perfectly capable computers. Think about what that means. Machines that could browse the internet, run office software, edit photos, play games, machines with years of useful life left in them, were suddenly told by their own operating system that they were obsolete. Not because they had stopped working, because a checkbox in a security requirement said so. And this is where everything changes, because that single decision created something Microsoft did not anticipate. A captive audience of frustrated, computer-literate people with working hardware and nowhere sanctioned to go. Some of them paid for extended security updates, buying time on borrowed years. Some of them gritted their teeth and bought new machines they did not want to buy, just to keep receiving updates. But a growing number of them did something Microsoft clearly did not expect. They searched for an alternative. And for the first time in the history of that search, the alternative was actually ready for them. This is the part of the story that matters most, and it is the part almost nobody outside the enthusiast community fully understands. Linux in 2026 is not the Linux of 10 years ago. For most of computing history, gaming was the one wall Linux could never climb. You could argue Linux was more stable, more private, more efficient, and you would have been right. But none of that mattered to the average person, because the moment they tried to launch their favorite game, it simply did not run. That wall did not crumble because of a grassroots movement or an open source miracle. It crumbled because one company with billions of dollars and millions of customers decided to knock it down on purpose. That company is Valve, and the tool they built to do it is called Proton. Proton is a compatibility layer built on the older open source project Wine, but engineered and funded with a level of resources that volunteer hobbyist projects never had access to. It intercepts the calls a Windows game makes and translates them, in real time, into instructions a Linux system can actually execute, using a translation layer called DXVK to convert direct 3D graphics commands into Vulkan. What that means in practice is staggering. Out of Steam's massive catalog of over 117,000 games, roughly 106,000 of them are now playable on Linux through Proton, compared to barely 9,000 that had native Linux versions on their own. Read that again. Valve did not wait for developers to port their games to Linux. They built a machine that makes porting unnecessary. And once that machine existed, the single biggest reason regular people avoided Linux for decades simply stopped being true. But Valve did not stop at software. They built the hardware to match it. The Steam Deck, a handheld gaming PC running a customized Linux distribution called Steam OS, shipped an estimated 5.6 million units by the middle of last year alone, capturing something close to half of the entire tracked handheld gaming PC market. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. Millions of people bought a Steam Deck because they wanted to play games on the go. Most of them were not thinking about operating systems at all. They were thinking about convenience, about portability, about price, and without realizing it, every single one of them became a Linux user. This is not chaos. This is strategy. Valve did not ask consumers to choose Linux ideologically. They simply removed the reason that anyone needed to avoid it. The numbers coming out of this year confirm just how far the shift has gone. In March of 2026, Valve's own hardware survey recorded Linux at 5.33% of the Steam user base, an all-time high, and the single largest month-over-month jump the survey has ever recorded, a rise of over 3 full percentage points in one snapshot. In that same period, Windows fell more than 4 points, dropping to just above 92%. And macOS, Apple's own desktop operating system, was pushed into third place behind Linux for the first time in Steam's entire recorded history. Let that sink in. Linux, the operating system tech culture, spent decades treating as a punchline for command line obsessives, just outperformed Apple on one of the largest gaming platforms on the planet. Here is where most explanations stop, and where the real story keeps going. Because this is not only about gamers switching handhelds, it is about what is happening underneath the surface of the entire Windows ecosystem. And it explains why this shift feels less like a trend and more like a structural collapse in slow motion. Look at what happened inside Windows itself during that same March 2026 survey period. Windows 10 usage among Steam users dropped by nearly 15 percentage points in a single month, an enormous, almost violent decline. But Windows 11, the operating system Microsoft has spent years pushing, as the mandatory replacement, only gained about 10.5 points in that same window. According to informed analysis of that gap, the math does not add up in Microsoft's favor. If every Windows 10 user who left had simply upgraded to Windows 11, the numbers would move together, one falling exactly as much as the other rises. They did not. A meaningful chunk of users leaving Windows 10 did not go to Windows 11 at all. They left the Windows ecosystem entirely. What most people are not seeing is that Windows is not just losing to Linux from the outside, it is fracturing from the inside. Now here is the part that turns this from a gaming statistic into something much bigger, because Steam is only the visible surface of a much deeper migration that is happening across the entire computing world, largely outside of public attention. According to data tracked by StatCounter, Linux's share of the total global desktop market, not just gamers, not just enthusiasts, but every desktop computer being measured, has climbed to roughly 3 to 4% worldwide, nearly doubling from where it stood just 2 years earlier. That might still sound small next to Windows' roughly 60 to 70% share of the same measurement, and it is. Windows is still the dominant desktop operating system on Earth, and nothing about these numbers changes that overnight. But the direction of travel is the story here, not the current size. Windows just recorded its largest single-month drop in that same tracking data in 3 years, falling from over 66% to under 61%. Its lowest recorded share since that dataset began being tracked back in 2009. According to the researchers who track this data, part of that collapse is explained by a surge in unidentified and bot traffic skewing the numbers. But even accounting for that noise, the trend line underneath it has been pointing in one direction for over a year, and it is not pointing toward Windows. And this is where the story stops being about hobbyists entirely, because governments have started making the same calculation. France has begun migrating an enormous portion of its public sector computing infrastructure, reportedly touching as many as 2.5 million government devices, away from Windows and toward open source alternatives. Think about what that decision actually represents. This is not a teenager installing Linux on an old laptop for fun. This is a sovereign government managing sensitive infrastructure, weighing licensing costs, security concerns, and long-term independence from a single foreign software vendor, and concluding that continued reliance on Windows is a liability rather than a convenience. When a government makes that calculation, it is rarely about ideology. It is almost always about cost, control, and risk. And if a government the size of France's is willing to bet that migration works at scale, it becomes very hard to argue that this is still just a fringe experiment. The cloud tells an even more brutal version of the same story, and this is where the irony becomes almost impossible to ignore. According to data from Amazon Web Services, over 90% of its EC2 cloud computing instances run on Linux, not Windows. Across the internet at large, research from W3Techs indicates that Linux now powers more than 60% of all websites where the underlying operating system can be identified. And here is the detail that should make every Windows executive uncomfortable. Microsoft's own cloud platform, Azure, the company's flagship cloud product, runs more Linux virtual machines on its servers than it runs machines using Microsoft's own operating system. Microsoft has confirmed this publicly. Read that again, slowly, because it deserves to be read twice. The company that built Windows, marketed Windows, and dominated the desktop world with Windows for over 30 years is quietly running the majority of its own cloud infrastructure on the operating system of its biggest rival. That is not coincidence. That is Microsoft's own engineers, under zero public pressure, to make a symbolic statement, choosing the more efficient, more stable, more cost-effective option when nobody was watching. What does it say when the company selling you Windows will not use it to run its own servers at scale? Here's where we need to talk about why, because up to this point, we have only described what is happening. The why is the part that turns this into more than a statistics story. It becomes a story about trust. Independent testing, comparing identical hardware running Windows 11 against modern Linux distributions, has produced numbers that are difficult to spin in Microsoft's favor. Linux systems on the same machines have been measured using up to 74% less idle memory than Windows 11. Meaning the operating system itself consumes a dramatically smaller share of a computer's resources just sitting there doing nothing. Boot times on equivalent hardware have been measured as roughly 40% faster. In cloud computing cost comparisons, running infrastructure on Linux instead of Windows has been documented to reduce costs by as much as 42%, a gap driven partly by licensing fees that Linux, as free and open source software, simply does not carry. None of these numbers alone would be enough to trigger a mass migration. But stacked together, year after year, they create a quiet, compounding case that becomes harder and harder to ignore, especially for anyone managing hardware, budgets, or infrastructure at scale. But the deeper wound, the one that explains why ordinary consumers, not just IT departments, are walking away, is not about performance benchmarks at all. It is about how Windows has started to feel to the people using it every single day. Over the past several years, Windows 11 has quietly folded in features that users never asked for and, in many cases, actively tried to remove. Advertisements have appeared inside the Start menu. AI assistants have been pushed into the operating system by default, sometimes re-enabling themselves after users specifically turned them off. Telemetry, the constant background collection of usage data sent back to Microsoft, has become deeply embedded into the core experience, difficult to fully disable even for technically sophisticated users. This is where the emotional core of this entire migration actually lives. It is not really about gaming benchmarks or boot times. It is about a growing, widespread feeling that people no longer fully control the computer sitting in front of them. What most people are not seeing, or perhaps are seeing but have not put into words, is the sense that Windows increasingly treats the user not as a customer being served, but as a product being monetized. And that is precisely the emotional vacuum that Linux, almost by accident, has stepped into. Linux does not insert advertisements into your file browser. It does not push AI assistants onto your desktop that you never requested. It does not quietly re-enable settings you deliberately turned off after an update. According to longtime users who made the switch, the appeal is almost disturbingly simple. It gets out of your way. It runs the hardware you already own, including machines Microsoft has officially declared too old to matter. It costs nothing to license. And modern distributions, built specifically to ease the transition. Names like Linux Mint with its familiar desktop layout, or newer releases like Zorin OS with interfaces designed to feel instantly recognizable to Windows and Mac refugees alike, have stripped away almost every technical barrier that used to make switching intimidating. This is where the story would normally end for most creators covering this topic, but the real story is the part almost nobody wants to say out loud, because it complicates the tidy narrative of Linux triumphing over Windows. Windows still wins, decisively in specific battlegrounds, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Professional creative software remains the single largest wall Linux has not fully torn down. Adobe's entire creative suite, the industry standard for photo editing, video production, and design work relied upon by millions of professionals, simply does not exist natively on Linux. Open source alternatives exist, tools capable in their own right, but they are not identical replacements, and for professionals whose livelihoods depend on specific software ecosystems, that gap alone can be a deal breaker. Certain competitive multiplayer games, particularly titles protected by aggressive kernel-level anti-cheat systems, still refuse to run on Linux at all, locking out Linux users from entire genres of online gaming regardless of how good Proton has become. And GPU driver quality remains uneven across manufacturers. On modern hardware from AMD and NVIDIA, Linux gaming performance has closed to within roughly 80% of Windows in many demanding titles. But on Intel's newer ARC graphics cards, that gap widens dramatically, with some benchmarks showing Windows outperforming Linux by nearly 3 times at certain resolutions. A stark reminder that this transition is uneven, fragile, and far from finished. So where does that leave the balance of power right now, in the middle of 2026? The honest answer is uncomfortable for anyone hoping for a clean, dramatic ending. Windows is not collapsing. It still commands the overwhelming majority of desktop computers on Earth, the overwhelming majority of gamers, and near total dominance in professional creative industries. But the direction of travel has become undeniable, and direction is often more important than current position, because direction reveals where power is actually flowing, not where it currently sits. A year ago, Linux sat at roughly 2% of Steam's user base. Today, it sits above 5%. A government the size of France is actively migrating millions of devices away from Windows. Microsoft's own cloud infrastructure runs predominantly on the rival operating system it competes against on every retail shelf in the world. And the very users. Microsoft depends on most gamers, developers, and power users who influence purchasing decisions for friends and family are increasingly the ones leading the exodus. Microsoft is not blind to any of this. According to reporting on the company's own public statements, Microsoft has acknowledged internally that Windows 11's reputation needs repair, committing publicly to fixing aspects of the operating system that have generated the most user backlash. At the same time, Microsoft is preparing its own countermove in the gaming space, developing a next-generation hybrid device under the Xbox brand designed to blend console simplicity with PC power, running a specially optimized version of Windows built specifically to compete with the very momentum Steam Deck and Steam OS have created. That is not the move of a company that feels safe. That is the move of a company that has looked at the shuju, looked at the trend lines, and recognized that if it does nothing, the erosion does not stop at 5%. Even Valve's next hardware ambitions, a rumored Steam machine designed to extend Steam OS beyond handhelds and into the living room and the desktop, suggest that this is not a temporary spike destined to fade. It is the opening phase of something much larger, something that even chip manufacturers are beginning to hedge their bets on, with reports that NVIDIA has begun hiring engineers specifically dedicated to optimizing Linux gaming performance, a tacit admission from one of the most powerful hardware companies on the planet that Linux gaming is no longer a niche worth ignoring. So the question the title of this video asks is not really about Bill Gates losing his temper in some private meeting nobody will ever see footage of. The real question is bigger and far more uncomfortable for the company he built. It is whether an operating system that dominated the world for over 3 decades can survive the accumulated weight of its own decisions, the forced obsolescence of working hardware, the advertisements slipped into places users never wanted them, the AI features nobody asked for reappearing after being switched off, the quiet abandonment of the trust that made Windows the default choice for an entire generation of computer users. Linux did not win this by outspending Microsoft. It did not win by outmarketing a trillion-dollar company. It won slowly, patiently, by simply staying out of the way while Windows gave its own users more and more reasons to start looking for an exit. What happens next is genuinely unknown, and anyone claiming certainty about it is not being honest with you. Does Microsoft manage to win back the trust it has spent years eroding, rolling back the advertisements, respecting the boundaries users set, and rebuilding Windows into something people choose rather than something people tolerate? Or has the migration already reached the point where reversing it is no longer possible, where every year that passes only adds more converts who never look back, more governments following France's lead, more developers optimizing for a platform they once ignored? The 5% mark that Linux just crossed on Steam is not the end of the story. It might not even be the middle. It is simply the first number large enough that nobody serious can pretend not to see it anymore. And somewhere inside Microsoft's headquarters, behind closed doors, in meetings the public will never be shown, that number is almost certainly being discussed with a level of seriousness that would have seemed unthinkable just a few short years ago. The empire is still standing, but for the first time in over 30 years, it is no longer standing alone, and whether it remains standing at all 10 years from now may depend entirely on what Microsoft chooses to do in the very short window it still has left.